This is the easiest money you're gonna make. And your line of work? That's a godsend." I stared at the generic, nameless suit standing in front of me. He claimed that he worked for the CIA, even flashed his badge and all. It didn't matter to me whether or not I believed him. The only thing that mattered was the fact that he paid half up front, promising the other half after the job was done. I'm part of a freelance mercenary group, modern-day soldiers of fortune. We've been hired by government agencies before, but mostly just ones in Africa and Southeast Asia. You can imagine the type of shit we've been asked to pull off. Safe to say, ethics aren't our primary concern. Now, I'm not blatantly immoral. If somebody offered us an exorbitant amount of money to oversee security for a human trafficking ring, I'd shoot them on the spot. But that's not to say that we're good people. Far from it, in fact. I don't expect you to feel sympathy for me. I just want to get my story out there. Something very strange is going on. Something that we should all probably be worried about. The mission itself was presented as a simple one, but the circumstances surrounding it were more unusual. We're staging a raid on a fanatical religious cult in Montana. Real psychotic bunch. I remember the suit telling me. I couldn't have imagined a better compensation than the one he was offering, so I listened intently. In all honesty, it was nearly enough to set my entire team up for retirement. Nevertheless, the whole situation unnerved me. We were caught completely off guard when they contacted us. Somehow they'd found our email address on the dark web. I knew what we were doing was illegal, but they didn't seem to care. In fact, they never mentioned anything about our past crimes at all. In reality, they probably could have smoked us at any point. It didn't make a lot of sense why they chose not to, or why they chose to approach us at all. I had my hunches, of course. Most of them to do with the fact that we were probably entirely expendable and operated under the radar the best we could. Obviously, we didn't do a good enough job. Whatever, it is what it is. We needed this payday. Our little operations couldn't last forever. I know it's not important for the job, but what's the purpose of this raid? These guys are growing weed or something? I asked. The question came out snarkier than I'd intended it to. The suit just grinned. I guess he had a sense of humor. "Well," he began, "I doubt you'll be telling anybody, so I suppose you might as well know." He seemed confident in that assumption, maybe a little too much so. "These people have stumbled upon something that they shouldn't have, and then they tried to hide it. Better not be something that's moments away from exploding," I said. The suit laughed this time. "It ain't so simple. What do you know about the existence of extraterrestrial life?" I raised my eyebrow. What the hell was he about to tell me? "You're asking me if I believe in aliens," I responded. I took a second to consider it. Sure, why not? He went on to explain the real objective. It sounded absurd, but it was also coming out of the horse's mouth. You tell me what I'm supposed to believe. Apparently, a UFO had crashed on a farm in southeastern Montana a few days prior. As luck would have it, this farm belonged to the Church of Blissful Ascension, the cult in question. Shortly after it landed, some cult members stumbled upon it, subsequently being ordered to drag it into the leader's farmhouse, which was quite literally a mansion. Not much was known about the leader, other than his epithet, which was the Divine Messenger. Yeah, that type of guy. In reality, the cult was just a front for the trafficking of various goods, which had brainwashed its members into doing a lot of the dirty work. The most interesting part about this was the UFO itself. It was allegedly about 12 feet wide, 3 feet in diameter, and shaped like a pill. Before it landed, it had been moving erratically, seemingly teleporting short distances every few seconds or so. After it landed, some kind of dark green fluid began leaking out of it. Now for the actual mission. We simply had to go in and assist a team of SOG agents in wiping out every single member. No survivors, no witnesses, no exceptions. What the CIA planned to do with the UFO afterwards was none of our business. Not that I really wanted to know. We didn't have much time to prepare for the raid, but it didn't sound like we needed it. We were dealing with amateurs, most likely just trigger-happy rednecks who couldn't strategize or aim for shit. I suppose raid wasn't the most apt way to describe the job. It seemed more like a slaughter than anything else. My team of 6 met up with the SOG team, also 6, at a small underground complex used by the CIA for clandestine operations located about 30 minutes away from the farm. There, we geared up, went over tactics, and were told to repeat the objective at hand. No witnesses, no survivors. After all that was said and done, we piled into a SWAT truck and drove off. We'd never worked with the CIA in the past, so we supposed this was standard procedure. We suited up in black tactical gear provided by the agents themselves. This part was a bit odd to me. We had our own gear, stuff we've been using for the longest time. Both sets were nearly identical, but the agents still insisted that we use theirs. The atmosphere in the truck was also disconcerting. Maybe it was just in my head, but everybody seemed so stiff. The agents clutched their rifles with iron grips while staring blankly ahead. My team tried talking amongst ourselves, but every word just felt awkward. I just chalked it up to nerves, which didn't make any sense, because I never felt nerves like that before. After what felt like hours, we finally arrived, stopping some odd yards away from the farmhouse in order to remain undetected. We piled out, got into formation, and began. I was assigned the furthest flank position, so I stayed back as everyone else moved ahead. The closest people in front of me were one of my guys and an agent. It didn't take long for the strangeness to amplify. I noticed that the agent was gradually moving slower and slower. Eventually, I caught up to him. Well, it was more like I was forced to catch up. If I'd been moving any slower, I would have stopped. This agent had ruined the entire formation without anybody in the front noticing. "What the hell are you doing?" I asked as I walked up beside him. Without answering my question, he handed me a small scrap of paper. I took a quick glance at it, seeing an address and a date and time written down on it. "Meet me. Don't be late," he said, no inflection at all in his voice. "Do whatever you can to stay alive." As soon as he finished saying that, he sped up, reclaiming his original position. Obviously, that interaction was a cause for concern. I had to start wondering just what the hell I'd gotten my team into. I seriously started considering calling it off right then and there, but before I knew it, bullets were flying. The agents at the front had taken out the 2 guards standing at the front entrance. Soon after, we blew the door down and stormed inside. The agents shot down a few more guards stationed on the main floor before we started heading towards the basement. Once we got down there, 10 more guards or cult members were waiting for us. As per the mission, I raised my rifle and prepared to fire. Unfortunately, I couldn't have been prepared for what happened next. The agent at the front raised his fist, signaling for us to stop. Surprisingly, the guards didn't shoot at us. In fact, they didn't even react. The agents began turning around before aiming their rifles at us instead. There's been a change of plans. We'd been set up, that much was obvious. I didn't even have time to curse before the shit went off the rails. I ducked, feverishly trying to avoid point-blank gunfire while firing off nearly blind retaliatory shots. I managed to stumble my way behind some cover but not before having 2 bullets graze my cheek and thigh. I peeked out, seeing the cult guards with malicious grins across their faces, also shooting at me and my team. Amidst the chaos, I could see Faisal, one of my men, rush an agent in an attempt to take him down to the ground. It was definitely a desperation move, but despite Faisal being substantially larger than the agent, his takedown was stuffed and he was subsequently thrown into a pillar. I could feel rage washing over me. I raised my rifle, aimed at the agent's head, and fired. He didn't go down. My aim wasn't the issue. I could see the bullets drilling into the side of his helmet. The guy even flinched, but he didn't fall. Instead, he finished Faisal with a shot to the head and walked off. My mouth fell agape as I started backing up. I guess I was pretty rattled because I stopped paying attention to my surroundings. I felt myself bump into somebody before spinning around to see another agent staring me down. I thought about going for my knife, but before I could even make a move, the agent grabbed my arm and effortlessly judo slammed me onto the floor. I'd been thrown before, but this was by far the most painful one I'd ever experienced. It felt like I was being tossed by a gorilla, not by a man with a similar build to me. His strength was ridiculous. Once on the ground, he mounted me before raising a fist. I knew with every fiber of my being that a single punch would pulverize my entire skull. As I started preparing my soul for the afterlife, the agent hesitated. "Play dead," he whispered, his voice a familiar one. He slammed his fist down inches away from my head and crashed the floor next to me before flipping me face down. "Don't move, no matter what happens," he whispered again. The pressure blanketing my body soon disappeared. The agent was getting up. I know what he said, but I didn't want to listen. I wanted to help my team. I got them into this mess, so I was obligated to get them out. But I didn't move. I knew it was useless. The basement had gotten quiet. No more sounds of struggle. My team was dead, and it was entirely my fault. Moments later, someone began talking, snapping me out of my self-pity session. "Geez, job well done, huh?" It didn't sound like one of the agents, so I assumed the voice belonged to a cult member. What the hell is going on? I thought to myself. Were they working together? "Now, about the payment." His question was interrupted by gunfire. A brief bout of additional chaos followed as more bodies dropped to the floor. I counted about 10 in total. I guess they weren't working together after all. "All right, let's make this quick," one of the agents said. I had to wonder what he was talking about. What more did they need to do? I listened to the sounds of scuffling boots as the agents went around doing something. I opened one of my eyes just a sliver, trying to make out what the hell was going on. I wish I'd kept it closed. I was lying right next to Ricardo, one of my team members. As I stared at his lifeless, bullet-ridden body, I wanted to scream. I forced myself to keep my mouth shut. I continued watching as the agents went around to every single body, both my team and the cult members, and injected some kind of dark green fluid into their veins. Soon enough, they got to me. I held my breath and laid stiff as I felt the needle go into my arm. Thankfully, the guy didn't check my pulse. I was losing my mind at this point. Not just because I was playing dead while some mystery fluid was being mixed into my bloodstream. It was the whole situation. If this hadn't been the worst day of my life, then it was certainly a contender. Afterwards, I heard the agents mumbling to each other. I couldn't make out much, but I did hear 12 hours being said quite a lot. 12 hours. 12 hours to what? After about 5 more minutes, the agents finally left. I laid still for some time after that. I wasn't exactly looking forward to seeing what the agents had left behind, but I wouldn't be able to get to the bottom of this by wasting my time mourning. My entire body was in pain as I pulled myself up. And trying not to look at the massacre around me, I took out the piece of paper that one agent had given to me. The address belonged to a motel in Billings, while the meeting time was in 10 hours. I stripped off all of my gear and made myself look as presentable as I possibly could before getting the hell out of a farmhouse and trying to hitch a ride on a nearby road. A couple of hours and $200 later, somebody finally agreed to give me a ride. Luckily, Billings isn't too far away from the farm, so I think that I'll be able to get to the motel in time. But I'm not so sure that I'm gonna like whatever's waiting for me there. Making it to Billings took me longer than I'd expected it to. As it turns out, hitchhiking on a remote road during the middle of the night isn't the safest thing you could do. Go figure, huh? It was fine, though. Nothing I couldn't handle. With that said, my real problems were still ahead of me. I didn't quite remember what the agent who slipped me the paper looked like. When we met up, they were all already wearing gear. He was definitely white, though, about 6 feet tall, a fairly muscular build. It shouldn't be too difficult to spot. The paper also specified that he'd be in the lobby, so that's where I headed once I found the motel. Once in, I looked around. The place was nearly empty, with only 4 people sitting around. An older couple, a single woman, and a single man. He was white, tall, or probably in his 30s. Most likely who I was looking for. "Tell me you're the guy I'm looking for," I said, approaching him. The man looked up at me as his expression morphed into one of confusion. He shook his head. "I think you're mistaken, sir. I don't know what you mean." I muttered out something along the lines of, "My bad," before getting ready to walk away. But before I could, the man started chuckling. Yep, this was the guy. "You look so worried there," he said in between laughs. Jesus, that's funny. Safe to say, I was starting to get pissed off. "What the hell is going on?" I asked. The agent wiped a tear from his eye as he calmed down, before checking the time. 20 minutes left, he said. It was pretty obvious what he was talking about. Had it really been close to 12 hours? "What's going to happen in 20 minutes? The man grabbed his jacket and got up. "Nothing good. Follow me." "Follow you to where? I'll kick your ass if you don't tell me what's going on right now," I said, anger rising in my voice. "Right here? In the lobby? That's a bad idea. Come up to my room and do it there instead," he responded. Before I could say anything else, he was already walking up the stairs. I followed close behind, nearly fuming at how shady he was acting. Once he opened the door to his room, I couldn't stop myself from lunging in and grabbing his throat. He didn't even fight back, but at the same time, it didn't seem like he needed to. His neck inexplicably felt like a thick steel pipe. The harder I gripped, the harder it hurt my hand. Soon enough, I just let go. I stepped back, a dumbfounded expression on my face. The agent checked the time again. "You done now?" I didn't respond. He grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the mini-fridge and poured out 2 big glasses, sliding me one while downing his own at the same time. "I'd recommend you drink that quick." I took a deep breath and calmed myself down. "What did you inject me with? What's going to happen to me?" "Well, you're going to find out if you keep asking questions. And trust me, you really don't want to find out." He opened up the closet and unlocked the safe inside. He took out a briefcase, flipping it open to reveal 4 syringes. This time, they were filled with blue liquid. "Drink up," he said, gesturing towards the liquor, "'cause this is gonna hurt. If you think I'll let you inject me with something else, you're an idiot. Tell me what the hell is going on right now." He laughed obnoxiously. You're calling me an idiot? The same guy who put enough trust in the government to take one of the most blatantly sketchy jobs of all time is calling me an idiot? That's rich. You guys should have jumped out of the truck when you had the chance. I considered responding, but bit my tongue instead. I really couldn't argue against that. It certainly wasn't my brightest moment. It doesn't matter. You still need to tell me what's going on. Trust me, I will, but you need this first, he said, holding up one of the syringes. I shook my head. No, what I need first is an explanation. The agent sighed, checking the time once again. 10 minutes. You really want to make this more painful than it needs to be? I guess so. I wasn't budging. Again, not one of my brightest moments. The man shrugged, sitting back in his chair. So be it. We'll wait. The stern, confident face I was putting on certainly didn't reflect how I was actually feeling at the moment. The agent had a stranglehold on me in just about every conceivable aspect. I hated that fact. I never could accept people having power over me. If I were a smarter man, I would have just listened. But here we are. 10 minutes passed and nothing happened. I nearly breathed a sigh of relief until I felt my arm starting to itch. I scratched at it, only to feel my finger quite literally digging into my flesh. It looked like my skin was rotting away, and it was spreading fast. So, the agent said, holding up the syringe. You want it now? Screw it, I spat, catching it as he tossed it to me. The pain was starting to become unbearable. I stuck the needle into my vein and pumped the mystery fluid into my bloodstream. At that point, the rot had completely consumed my forearm. It was horrifyingly disgusting to look at. In my mind, there was no fate worse than that stuff spreading to the rest of my body. That's rapid necrosis right there, the agent said. And you just injected the antidote. I felt immense relief immediately after. I watched as the rot slowly crept back down my arm before disappearing completely. In that moment, a wave of euphoria washed over me. I've never done heroin, but I imagine the sensations would be comparable. Enjoy that feeling, the agent continued, because the hard part is coming up soon. I didn't have to ask what he meant by that. It was as if a flip had suddenly switched. The euphoria was immediately replaced with the most excruciating pain I'd ever experienced in my entire life, even worse than when the rot was consuming my arm. This is why I made you a drink, the agent went on. The pain will only last 10 minutes. Try and keep it down, though. We don't need any noise complaints. Those 10 minutes seemed like 20 hours. If you were to ask me exactly what I was feeling, I would have had a hard time describing it. Hell. Simply put, it was sheer hell. As if every molecule in my body was being tossed into an industrial meat grinder before the remnants were dropped into molten lava. I laid on the ground for a few moments after it had passed. To tell you the truth, I wanted to lay there for a lot longer, but then I remembered where I was. I looked back up, rushing back at the agent. If I was pissed before, I was about to explode now. What the hell was that? I screamed in his face as I began trying to strangle him again. It was strange. His throat didn't feel like metal anymore. It just felt like regular flesh. I could even see his face starting to turn red. I grinned. I was finally getting the upper hand. It seemed like the antidote had more than a few side effects, but that didn't last long. He grabbed my arm and elbowed me in the face before somehow managing to reverse our positions and mount me. From there, he put me in an arm lock. All right, he said. You got that out of your system? Can I explain to you what the hell is happening now? I tapped the floor, signaling yes. Well, all right, he said, letting go. We can finally make some progress. He pulled up a chair and sat down, still panting from our short grappling match, and I did the same. Why'd you kill my team? If we told anybody about the UFO, nobody would have even believed us. Hell, why'd you hire us in the first place? Slow down there. One question at a time. The first thing you need to know is... He paused for a moment, almost as if an uncomfortable thought had just crossed his mind. There was no UFO crash, no aliens. That was all fake. I buried my face in my hands, trying to wrap my head around what the hell he'd just said. What? Before I continue, you want that drink now? He asked. I nodded. It seemed like I was gonna need it. If there was no UFO, then what was the point of the raid? It's simple, the agent said. To make it look like there was one. I'm not sure why I nodded. It's not like I understood what was going on in the slightest. Think about it, the agent continued. The CIA conducts a clandestine operation that involves covering up a UFO landing. It goes horribly wrong, and all the agents die. The agents? My team were the ones that died. The agent nodded. Yeah, and what uniforms were you wearing? I thought back, and suddenly it made complete sense why they didn't want us wearing our own uniforms. SAC gear, I responded. But that still doesn't make any sense. Every agent should have been registered, right? We sure as hell weren't. That's right, the agent responded. But it doesn't matter. He gestured towards an empty syringe sitting on the table. Once the necrosis finishes, there would have been nothing left but bones. Nothing left to try and identify. It's a real nasty concoction. Fair enough, I said. So, the CIA backs a raid in order to conceal a potential UFO crash. The mission ends in disaster, and everybody, including the cult members, die in an inexplicable way. The agent nodded. The aftermath yields a burning question. Who, or what, killed them? I sat back. The implication seemed so ridiculous it was comical. The aliens liquefied everybody and escaped out into the world. The agent smirked. Now you're getting it. I don't think I am. How do hostile aliens run amok and benefit the CIA in any capacity? The agent poured himself some more liquor. That part, I'll admit, it's a bit complicated. And complicated it was. This is where his story goes batshit crazy. According to him, this whole debacle started years prior, with one man at the center of it all. Jonas Kane. And to the best of everybody's knowledge, Kane was a civilian, not a former SEAL, Ranger, or anything to that effect. In the span of just 2 months, he managed to gain the favor of a sizable portion of the higher-ups at the CIA, effectively splitting the organization in factions. It didn't take long for his side to start overwhelming the other. Stating that he essentially held the CIA in the palm of his hand wouldn't have been a stretch. So, how does a regular guy manage to do all of this? Well, the why to that question was pretty obvious. The how was another story entirely. The antidote, the agent said, holding up another of the blue syringes. I couldn't tell you the scientific name, so we just call it the God Serum. Kane's claim to fame. I half scoffed, half chuckled. Read a lot of comics? Still a teenager at heart. That's just my coping mechanism for all the atrocities I've committed, though. I couldn't tell if that was a joke or not. So, Kane developed this serum by himself? The agent nodded. That's the way it seems. Well, what does it do exactly? Despite how dumb I thought the name was, it wasn't terribly inaccurate. On top of immediately healing any injury or disease, like necrosis, the user essentially ascended into a superhuman state. How strong somebody could be depended on their own genetics. Their base physical attributes could be enhanced 20-fold, at the minimum, all the way to a staggering 55. Slow twitch muscle strength, striking power, speed, endurance, durability, you name it. It was the super soldier serum on additional steroids. And from what they've seen so far, there haven't been any discernible negative side effects. Kane was also the only one who knew how to make it, and he wasn't sharing his secrets. They gave him a stranglehold on just about the entire organization. And can't the CIA just force the recipe out of him? You know, advanced torture techniques or something? That's an option, yeah, the agent responded. But easier said than done. The upper limit of 55-fold enhancement only applies to the serum he's given us. Kane's different from the rest of us. He's on something else entirely. What I'm trying to say is, he's unstoppable, uncontrollable. Machine guns, snipers, explosives, tranquilizers, nothing does shit to him. If we're Captain America, he's Superman. Nobody can force him to do anything. I shook my head. This sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? Are you hearing yourself? Hey, I don't disagree. But as absurd as it sounds, it's the truth. And isn't that what you wanted to know? The truth? The agent responded. Anyways, that's the how of this whole story. Kane wasn't a scientist either. Up until 2018, he was registered as a traffic court lawyer in Oklahoma. We don't know how the hell he managed to do any of this, but the worst thing about this whole situation is that we don't even know what he's trying to do, what his endgame is. The agent stood up, lit a cigarette, and began pacing. But it sure as hell probably isn't anything good. And combine this with the fact that he's got most of the CIA wrapped around his thumb and we have a disaster on our hands, he's getting more and more influenced by the day. If he continues to go unchecked, well, you get it, don't you? If the agent was telling the truth, then this was indeed a nightmare scenario. Evil Superman as world dictator, forcing the world to believe we were being attacked by aliens for unknown reasons. What a bright future. So, what are you then? Leader of the anti-Kane faction or something? Not the leader, he said, shaking his head. Just one of many moles inside Kane's faction, but we all have the same goal. I'll do anything to take him down. Well, I said, standing up. Sounds like you've got your work cut out for you. Good luck. I'll be heading out now. I knew he probably wasn't going to just let me leave. I could tell that he was trying to recruit me for something from the get-go. But after hearing all of this, on top of my entire team being killed... Wait, I nearly forgot about that. My team's dead, you know, I said, giving him a death stare. And you caused it. I don't give a hell if you're a double agent or what. How the hell am I supposed to forgive that? I'm not asking you to forgive me, but this is bigger than either of us, bigger than anything you could imagine. If Kane gets his way, I reckon your team would have been dead regardless. You don't have to forgive me. All I'm asking is that you work with me for now. If we succeed, I don't care what happens next. You can strangle me in my sleep for all that I care. He began stepping towards me. If you want your revenge, then you can have it. But there might not be a world for you to come back to. He extended his arm, implying that I shake his hand in agreement. Come on, you never dreamed about playing the hero when you were a kid? This might be your only chance. I swatted his hand away. What the hell do you want me for anyways? I can't even stop my team from dying. What good am I gonna be? It finally came out. I didn't blame the agent. I really only had myself to blame. A tough pill to swallow for sure. The agent paused for a moment. I couldn't even look him in the eye at this point. I knew he'd be able to see the weakness behind my own. And eventually, he held out his arm again. If I thought you weren't worth recruiting, then why the hell am I trying so hard? Come on, make the death of your team worth something. I'm still not shaking your hand, but tell me the plan. You guys do have a plan, right? The agent grinned. Well, it's a work in progress. It's what? Instead of responding, he tossed me a jacket. I knew you'd say yes. Bundle up now. We're headed over to Russia. I've only been to Russia a few times before, but there is one solid conclusion I can draw about the country. It's one of the hardest places to complete contracts. The targets are usually hell to put down, and my heart feels like it's seconds away from detonating at all times. I do enjoy drinking over there, though. I managed to get some sleep on the flight over. That would have been impossible had I not been tired to the point of delusion. Our ride came in the form of a clunky old cargo plane that only had sitting space for the pilots. I think I banged my head on about 15 crates before I woke up. There's no flights to Norilsk, and I can't really take a government-owned aircraft without arousing suspicion, so I had to call in a favor from an old friend, the agent explained. I'm sure he could see the trepidation on my face. Look, it's the best I could do. I suppose it didn't matter. The plane wasn't the biggest issue. It was what we were bound to see once we got off that worried me the most. Along with the agent and the pilots, there were 2 others on the plane with us, another SAC agent named Armin and a Green Beret named Luke. 4 wasn't exactly the biggest team, but the agent assured me that we'd be rendezvousing with the rest once we got to our destination. The flight was mostly silent and a bit awkward. So, what do I call you? I asked the agent in an attempt to make small talk. You don't have to tell me your real name, just give me something so it doesn't get weird. The agent leaned his head back, as if he were thinking about it. It's Colt. That's my real name, by the way. I trust you enough. He flashed a corny grin at me. I nodded in response. Colt it is. We landed on a small airstrip in the middle of what looked like a remote field. I was hit with the freezing rain the moment I stepped out of the plane, which managed to wake me up a bit. I looked around, but there was quite literally nothing surrounding us. You sure we're in the right place? Luke asked. Don't look like there's too much going on here. Colt looked at one of the pilots, an older, weary-looking gentleman, and nodded. The man lumbered out of the plane and began walking towards a nearby forest. This way, he said in a thick accent. It's just short walk. I underestimated what he meant by short. We walked for about 3 hours into the middle of the forest, all while lugging around 20 pounds of gear and being drenched by the ice-cold precipitation. At one point, we came across some kind of large, pill-shaped object stuck in the trees. It'll make sense later, Colt said when he saw me looking up at it. Just keep walking for now. After the arduous hike, the pilot finally stopped in a clearing and took out a metal detector. He scanned the ground for a bit before gesturing for the shovel that Colt was holding. After about a minute of digging, he uncovered something that looked like the entrance to a vault. Still there, he said, chuckling. Many bad memories here. He entered a code into the keypad and it opened, revealing a metal ladder leading down into oblivion. He took a deep breath as he got up, before putting his hand on Colt's shoulder. I'll be waiting in plane. Good luck, my friend. Colt nodded. 6 p.m. If we're not back by then, just leave. The pilot gave him one last glance before walking out of the clearing and out of sight. He didn't look so confident. Well, Colt said, turning on his helmet flashlight. Time to enter the belly of the beast. I couldn't tell you how long the climb was. I just knew that my arms were jelly by the end. There was also an indescribable smell lingering in the air. It wasn't putrid per se. It just felt like something I wasn't supposed to be breathing in. After scaling down the ladder, we finally found ourselves in some kind of underground military complex. It's an old KGB base, Colt explained, repurposed for modern-day Spetsnaz training. Spetsnaz? Is it a good idea to show up unannounced? Colt looked down at his watch. If everything's gone according to plan, then we should be fine. Well, how can I not be confident when you put it like that? I muttered. He started moving and we followed, passing through rooms that contained weightlifting equipment, shooting ranges, and mats for hand-to-hand training. Eventually, we came across the dining hall. I'll admit, I was a bit taken aback by what we found waiting for us. What in the Sam hell happened here? Luke asked. It was a bloodbath inside. Standing amongst the plates of spilt food and drink, there were about 20 soldiers and agents, with 5 more dead on the ground. I recognized roughly half as Spetsnaz, with the other half wearing generic tactical gear. I assumed the latter half were our guys. The ones who were dead were all Spetsnaz. Oh, jeez, Colt muttered, as he stared at the grisly scene around him. One of the non-Spetsnaz soldiers looked over at us. He was average height and incredibly handsome, save for the gnarly scar running down through one of his eyes. What the hell did you expect? He said. We're lucky it only got this bad. Saying that everybody looked on edge would have been an understatement. You showed them what the serum could do and they still didn't believe you? Colt said, stepping forward. Most did, the soldier responded. Not all. We should have expected that from the start. Well, do they believe you now? The soldier looked over his shoulder at the group of angry Spetsnaz behind him. He nodded at them, a few nodded back, and a few cursed at him in Russian. I guess. I mean, they stopped trying to kill us at least, so we've stopped killing them. Colt sighed and shook his head. For God's sake, Visser, he muttered before gesturing to Luke, Armin, and I. In any case, these are the new guys, all quite capable if I do say so myself. They're on the serum? The soldier, whose name was apparently Visser, asked. Colt nodded. The soldier walked forward and extended his arm, shaking each of our hands in quick succession. Like Colt mentioned, the name's Visser, he said. I'm glad you guys chose to be a part of this. We need all the help that we can get. He went on to fill us in on what was happening. Similar to Colt, Visser was an SAC agent acting as a mole inside of Kane's faction. After some lingering, he became privy to the time and location of Kane's second attack. The first one was in the US at a cult base. The second in Russia at a Spetsnaz complex. If the Russian government were led to believe that the aliens had landed on Earth and subsequently slaughtered an entire unit of their soldiers, Kane's plan to make the world believe they were in imminent danger would become one step closer to a reality. That object in the forest, that's supposed to be the UFO, isn't it? It was planted there? Visser nodded. You couldn't be more correct. The man's running an intricate operation, which is why we've got to put a wrench into it as fast and as hard as we can. So what happens next? Luke asked. In about an hour, Kane's forces are going to storm the place. They're going to do the same thing they did to your team, Colt added. Have his super soldiers kill all the Spetsnaz and then inject them with a necrotic agent. The deadly alien strikes again, and nobody's safe, not even some of the most skilled soldiers in the world. The US government will eventually find out and compare the incident to what happened in Montana. And it's going to keep happening all around the world until there's only one conclusion left to draw, Visser said. We tried explaining the situation. Another non-Spetsnaz soldier added. But like hell they were going to believe us. Our Russian's also pretty rusty. I think some things got lost in translation. We believe you now, one of the Spetsnaz said in English, stepping towards us. But only for now. If what you're saying does not happen... His face suddenly morphed into a vicious sneer. Well, you've killed 5 of my men. I don't care what drugs you've taken to become so strong. We will fight back. I heard one of the Spetsnaz in the back shout something to the effect of, And you couldn't bring anything for us? Sounds good, Chief, Visser replied, ignoring the outburst. But I promise you, we're saving lives here. The Russian soldier didn't seem impressed, Nevertheless, he stepped back for the time being. "So, from what it sounds like, they won't be expecting us, right?" Armin asked. I think it was the first time I'd ever heard him speak. Visser nodded affirmatively. "Good," Armin responded. "Makes our job simpler." "What's the size of the force coming for us?" I asked. That was something I couldn't confirm, but we've got 12 guys on the serum here. We should be fine, Visser responded. I nearly forgot about that. The enemy was superhuman, but so were we. "So, what are these?" I said, holding up my rifle. "Decorations?" Visser grinned. "We're going old school, baby." He rolled up his sleeves, showing off his wrapped wrists. "Hope you've kept up with your hand-to-hand training." The rest of the soldiers followed suit, dropping their weapons and beginning to stretch out their limbs. There's a reason I preferred assassination from a distance. I wasn't a fan of getting punched in the face and tossed into walls, but I suppose there was no getting out of this one. Visser walked over and tossed me a set of hand wraps. "We might hit hard, but we're hitting pretty hard targets as well. Don't want a broken wrist." The Spetsnaz soldiers hung back as the rest of us moved to the front. I already knew I was going to be hurting like hell by the end, so I prepared myself mentally. I'd been pummeled to near death a few times before, and I couldn't really afford to lose any more brain cells. Visser tapped his watch as the hour dwindled, and soon enough, we started hearing movement coming from the corridor up ahead. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and clenched my hands. I told myself that I was about to do something good, something that would benefit humanity in the long run. For a moment, that made me feel better. That feeling faded quickly when I looked at what had appeared in front of us. A horde of unfathomable creatures had gathered at the dining hall entrance. Their dark gray bodies were centipede-like, with a sizable stinger at the end of their tails. Their torsos were thick and slimy, with 4 veiny, beefy arms attached to the sides. Their fists were the size of bowling balls. They had 2 circular mouths lined with sharp teeth on either side of their face, with 3 sets of glowing, piercing eyes on top. Their hairs were wild and spiky, almost like blades shooting out from the top of their heads. Of course, none of us knew how to react. I looked over, watching as Colt's expression turned blank. "What the fuck?" Before he could even finish the sentence, the creatures began charging at us, shrieking so loud it felt like my brain was shaking. Safe to say, I don't think this was part of the plan. "Good grief," Colt muttered. "Things just can't be simple for once, can they?" The creatures were slow in their approach, but not as if they were sizing us up. There was something peculiar about the way that they moved. Not quite like predators hunting prey, more like a drone approaching its target. Their movements seemed calculated, methodical, almost robotic. "You said aliens," one of the Spetsnaz yelled out from the back. "So what the hell is this?" "This doesn't change much," Colt said. "These things are still here to kill you guys, and we're here to stop them." The creatures continued advancing at a steady pace. I looked back at our rifles, which were laid out on the tables. No matter how strong I'd become, the last thing I wanted to do was fight these things with my bare hands. Ah, hell. I turned back around, seeing that the creatures had begun charging. I clenched my fists. It didn't really look like I had a choice. I stepped forward as one of them lunged at me. I could only comprehend just how massive the thing was once I got up close to it. Not only did it tower over me, its body was well over 10 feet long. I twisted my hips and punched its head. It certainly did some damage, but at the cost of my knuckles shattering. A few seconds into the fight, and I was already in deep water. I jumped back due to the pain, but the creature just kept charging. It raised its stinger, and I was ill-prepared to block it. It stabbed me in the arm, not quite penetrating my skin. It still hurt like hell, though. I could see something dripping out of the tip as the creature pulled its stinger back, some kind of dark green fluid. I rushed forward and tried putting the creature into a standing choke before it could strike again. But it didn't work. The creature slammed me in the abdomen with one of its arms, sending me backwards and leaving me breathless. "Oh, screw this," I muttered. I pulled myself up and rushed over towards the rifles. I aimed the barrel at the creature's head and began spraying. Even though just about every bullet hit head-on, the abomination still wouldn't go down. Its head would snap back slightly with every impact, as bits of its skin and flesh exploded. Dark-colored blood spilled to the floor as it continued pressing forward, seemingly unbothered by the injuries. I cursed again and reloaded, before once again emptying the entire magazine into its face. It finally dropped this time. Even then, it still wasn't fully dead, jerking and writhing around on the floor. I clutched the rifle like a bat and slammed it into the back of the creature's head until it broke. That finally managed to finish it off for good. The adrenaline rush was so intense that it took me a second to notice it. There was something sticking out of the creature's flesh. I approached the corpse cautiously in order to get a closer look. I wasn't seeing things. Buried within the bone, cartilage, and tissue appeared to be wires, as if it were some type of robot. Before I could inspect any further, another one of these things lunged at me. I leapt back before gauging the situation around me. I spotted Colt fighting off two of the creatures at once barehanded. There were 4 more lying limp around him. The guy was a monster himself. But the rest of us weren't doing so well. Luke was trying his hardest not to get pummeled, while Armin was thrashing on the floor trying not to be strangled. Strangulation. I wouldn't have expected these kinds of creatures to resort to something like that. Everybody else was facing a similar struggle. The only one holding their own was Colt. But there was also someone missing. Somebody I couldn't immediately spot. Looking for something?" a voice from behind me said. I turned around, seeing Visser with a wicked grin on his face. "Visser, what the hell?" He interrupted by punching me hard in the throat. I began gasping for air as I fell to my knees. I looked up, watching as he casually strolled away, before walking up to Luke and unceremoniously breaking his arm. I tried standing up, but ended up getting knocked back down by one of the creatures. I could hardly fight back as it wrapped its massive hands around my throat, simultaneously drilling its stinger into my leg. This time, it managed to break my skin. What it was trying to do wasn't a mystery. It was injecting the necrotic agent into my veins. To my surprise, it let go of my throat before I passed out completely. In retrospect, it made sense. These things were probably programmed to move on after the injection was completed. I sat up, struggling to funnel air into my lungs. I looked around again, watching as Visser effortlessly subdued the rest of our team. At the same time, the creatures seemed to be completely ignoring him. Eventually, he made his way over to Colt, who still had his hands full with multiple creatures. Colt screamed something at him, but I couldn't hear what he said. Visser responded by punching him in the face. Compared to the rest of us, it took him a little longer to take down Colt, but he still managed to without breaking much of a sweat. It also didn't help that Colt was being tag-teamed by the creatures. With our team entirely down for the count, the creatures turned their attention towards the Spetsnaz, who'd been witnessing the entire ordeal at the back. These guys were done for, I thought to myself. Fighting these creatures was a hellish experience, even with the serum. I could only imagine facing them in my mortal state. It'd be a complete and utter slaughter. But the Spetsnaz didn't seem worried at all. There was no fear in their expressions. Their faces were stone, as if a gang of mere hooligans were standing in front of them. Some raised their rifles, some grabbed their knives. Despite the impossible odds, they were still going to fight. The lead Spetsnaz stepped forward before shouting something in Russian, and then they charged. As expected, it was a short, brutal struggle. I looked back at Visser. He appeared to be recording the entire thing, keeping only the Russians and the creatures in frame. Even though he only managed to capture a few seconds of footage at most, he took off right after. I suppose he got what he came for. It was shocking just how horrible the plan had gone. The Spetsnaz we were supposed to protect were all dead. Half of our team was knocked out cold, while the rest were injured. And not only that, Visser had apparently set up everything. A mole amongst moles. I could only imagine what was waiting for us next. The creatures had become stationary after finishing off the Russians. The details were all starting to align. These things were just machines made to look like biological entities. These were fake aliens. I could see Colt slowly pulling himself up as blood leaked from his nose and a large gash on his forehead. "Where'd Visser go?" he asked, spitting out blood. "He took off," I responded, after recording everything. Colt's eyes turned wide before he suddenly bolted up. He can't get away," he said, before sprinting back down the corridor like a bat out of hell. Everybody else was too roughed up to follow after him, but I wasn't. My right fist was broken, but that was about the extent of my problems. I started running after Visser as well. We made it out of the underground complex and back into the woods, where we could see a trail of fresh footprints in the snow. We tracked his trail for about 5 minutes before finally catching up to him. He didn't seem too alarmed. In fact, it looked like he was just taking a casual stroll through the woods. Colt wasn't about to waste time asking him any questions, immediately charging at him like a bull. He tried taking Visser down, but was met with an abrupt knee to the face instead. I tried running at Visser as well, but was knocked down before I could even lift my arms. It happened so quick that I'm not even sure what kind of move he pulled on me. In any case, I wasn't getting back up. It felt like my liver had just burst open. Colt wasn't done yet, though. With blood pouring from his mouth, nose, and eyes, he lifted himself up and started advancing towards Visser once again. What happened next was a one-sided beatdown, and Colt must have thrown over 50 strikes with only a couple landing. Even the ones that hit didn't seem to faze Visser in the slightest. He just shrugged everything off. Visser grabbed Colt by the arm and delivered a rib-shattering kick, which sent Colt tumbling back down to the ground. We were done for. Visser just looked at both of us and sighed. Commendable effort. You boys aren't giving up on the mission. I can respect that. He leered over Colt. But that also means I'd be dumb as hell if I let you live now. Visser grabbed Colt's throat and squeezed. You're a rat bastard, Colt rasped out as the air slowly vacated his lungs. Yeah. It is what it is. I wanted to pummel Visser right then and there with every fiber of my being, but I couldn't. I could only crawl towards him at a futile pace. I'll get to you next, buddy. Don't you worry, he said, grinning smugly at me. Colt stopped struggling after about 10 seconds. There you go, Visser said, almost in a whisper. Night. Then he turned his attention to me. If you told me 10 years ago that this is how I'd die, I'd probably laugh in your face. If you told me the same thing 1 year ago, well, that's a different story. At the end of the day, I had nobody to blame but myself. I never could go down the normal route, no matter how much the people in my life pleaded, no matter how much worry I caused them. I only ever wanted to live for myself. I still don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I suppose things could have been different, could have been better. Your thoughts race when death is lurking right in front of you. I don't know if time was slowing down in my mind, or if Visser was just taking his sweet time walking over, but I had a lot of time to think. A lot of time to regret. I sighed and closed my eyes. I never really believed in reincarnation, but at that moment I tried. I just hoped that I'd do better in my next life. I was waiting for him to kill me, and I kept waiting. But it wasn't happening. Eventually I opened my eyes. Visser was standing only a few feet from me, but his attention was focused elsewhere. I followed his gaze, spotting Luke standing at the edge of a clearing behind us. One of his arms was completely mangled, thanks to Visser, and he was bleeding profusely from a wound on his cheek. Despite that, he was still there, holding a pistol. Visser looked perplexed at the sight. I can't say I would have reacted differently. I couldn't comprehend what Luke was trying to do. Didn't I just kick your ass? And now you're here, pointing that pea shooter at me? I mean, I get it. I'm just as dedicated as the next guy. But this is getting ridiculous. Luke just grinned. I didn't want to waste this on you, but I'm kinda glad that I get to. He fired the weapon, hitting Visser in the chest, but not with a normal bullet. The projectile was some kind of liquid-filled capsule staining Visser's clothes and neck as it exploded upon impact. Visser looked at Luke, the smugness in his expression replaced with genuine concern. Now what in the hell was that? Try kicking my ass now, you son of a bitch, Luke responded. Visser's face contorted into a grimace as he stepped forward, but he couldn't even make it a few yards before collapsing. He went into a violent coughing fit as blood burst from his mouth. Oh, damn, he muttered. My father once said that no matter what you have, Luke began, it can still be taken away in a heartbeat. I never doubted him. He looked at me, tossing me a pair of handcuffs. Do me a favor and restrain him for me, Luke said, as his injured arm dangled gruesomely to the side. I'm a bit screwed up right now. No rush, though. He ain't going anywhere. I looked at Visser, who was still writhing and coughing up blood on the ground. I looked over at Colt, still lying limp beside him. I was seconds away from sharing the same fate. Maybe I had. Maybe I'd really been strangled lifeless and this was all just some posthumous hallucination. But I don't think the dead could feel as pissed off as I did in that moment. What happens next? I asked Luke. He shook his head. I don't know for sure, but I think things are about to start moving quick. Oh, what the hell did you do to me? Visser asked, still retching up mouthfuls of blood. His skin was becoming more red by the moment. Screw you, Luke responded. You don't get to ask any damn questions. Here's what we're gonna do. You give us the information that we want. He held up a vial of clear liquid. And I'll give you the antidote. Antidote? To what? Visser asked. What do you think? You have about 10 minutes before your skin starts bubbling up like a pizza in an oven. It's gonna look nasty. Say goodbye to that handsome face. Visser let out a pained chuckle. Oh, nice bluff. I don't feel shit. I'll survive whatever the hell this is. I had to commend his dedication to the lie. His face was going beet red, and his eyes looked about ready to pop out from his skull. Luke sighed. We can wait then. Let's see if your tune changes in the next few minutes. I couldn't tell what the hell Luke had blasted him with, but I'm sure as hell glad none of it was splashed onto me. The amount of pain that Visser was experiencing It seemed to multiply with every second that passed. After only a minute, he began screaming his lungs out, as if his head was being crushed under 10,000 tons. "You don't feel anything, huh?" Luke asked coldly. "What the hell was in that bullet?" I asked him. He just shook his head at me. "I'll tell you later." He walked over towards Visser and knelt down beside him. "I'll bet you're going through hell right now, aren't you? Well, brace yourself, 'cause this ain't even the peak of it." "New York," Visser muttered out. Luke grinned. "Now we're getting somewhere. If I fail to deliver the footage, then the next attack's gonna be in New York." "All right, so how do we stop it?" Visser let out an excruciating groan. He was starting to turn crimson. The sewers. They'll come out of the sewers." "Which area?" "Lower Manhattan." "When?" 2 days. 2 days from now, around noon." Luke nodded before standing back up. "New York, huh? Couldn't have picked a more generic place." "That's everything I know," Visser said, gritting his teeth through every word. "Give me the damn antidote." "One more question. Is Kane gonna be there himself?" Visser responded with a strenuous nod. "I think so. The damn antidote. Come on, man." "This?" Luke said, holding up the vial. Instead of handing it over, he opened it up himself before pouring it down his throat. Visser's expression dropped. "This is vodka. There is no antidote." Luke walked off, leaving Visser to scream in agony by himself. I'd be lying if I said that the whole sequence wasn't a bit jarring for me. I just had to stand there for a moment, watching him. It was like a train wreck. I couldn't take my eyes off of him. As big of a piece of shit as Visser was, I couldn't help but feel sorry for him just a bit. 2 days, Luke muttered to himself. That ain't a lot of time. Hell, we don't even know if he's telling the truth. So, that's where we're going? Manhattan? Luke nodded, although his face seemed to be stuck in a permanent grimace. We gained intel at the price of 2 valuable assets. 2 of them? I asked. Colt, I understand. What was the other? The bullet I shot at, Visser. That was supposed to be for Kane. It's the only thing that's capable of taking him down. I nearly choked on my own saliva when he said it. Are you kidding me? The words came out of my mouth almost instinctively. Why the hell would you waste it on him then? Relax. We had 2. There's 1 bullet left. We just need to have perfect aim. No big deal. What the hell was in that bullet? He went silent at my question before letting out a brief chuckle. You know what? I don't actually know. Before he gave me a further explanation, the rest of our team made their way into the clearing, all looking pretty roughed up. Armin came through first, his eyes widening upon seeing Colt's body. Ah, damn it, he muttered. His eyes then moved over to Visser, still convulsing on the ground. His dismay turned into anger as he stared at Luke. Oh, don't tell me you used it, Armin said, his eyes fixed on Luke in a death stare. What the hell were you thinking? He was filming the entire attack, Luke responded, his voice remaining calm. Could you imagine what would have happened if that footage made it to anybody significant? Armin shook his head, visibly pissed off.
It doesn't change the fact that you just took the biggest risk of all time. Did you get anything out of him at least?
Luke nodded. Next attack's gonna be in New York in 2 days. They're coming out of the sewers. Apparently, Kane's gonna be there as well. Armin took a moment to calm himself down.
Well, let's see if your decision pays off, or if you just screwed us permanently.
Yeah, Luke said, starting to walk off. Quit being so dramatic. Let's get to the plane.
Hang on,
Armin called after him.
What about your arm? Can you even move that thing?
Without turning back, Luke used his good arm to flash the OK symbol at him. Armin shook his head and mumbled something before following after him. I began walking as well, but felt Visser grab my ankle after only a few steps. You don't understand, I heard him mutter. I didn't even look down. I just shook his hand off of my leg and continued walking. Over the years, I've learned that some things are better ignored. After trekking and retracing our steps through the grueling woods, we found the plane waiting for us. The pilot scanned our group, but didn't say anything about Colt's absence, but I could certainly tell that he noticed it. Luke outlined our next steps on the flight back to New York. As expected, it was a bit haphazard, but we didn't have the luxury of planning ahead. Since Lower Manhattan was a relatively large place, we had a lot of ground to cover. Luke estimated that we'd be able to gather around 90 guys who were on our side in the short amount of time that we had. But that also meant telegraphing our plan to Kane's entire faction. That meant there was no going back, that this was going to be our final stand. And taking out Kane was also going to be difficult since we only had one bullet. And can't we just make more of them? Why do we have to rely on one? I asked. No can do. The only person capable of making these bullets is Kane himself. Oh shit, I wasn't expecting that. One of our moles actually managed to steal 5 of them from Kane's private lab, Luke continued. But then, things got messy. He was killed and we only managed to recover 2. And to be honest, I'm surprised Visser didn't know about it, or else he would have realized I was bluffing about the antidote. I guess Kane keeps some things pretty close to his chest.
And now we only have 1,
Armin added, glaring at Luke. But does Kane know that we have it? Luke nodded. That fact certainly don't help. He'll be expecting us to use it. With everything considered, it sounded like we were going to need a miracle to pull this off. Luke went on to list our 2 priorities in order of importance. Number 1, do not let any of the fake aliens out of the sewers and into the city. Number 2, eliminate Kane. They were simple in concept, presumably tougher to execute. One aspect of the plan bothered me more than anything else. We were barely strong enough to take down a single creature by ourselves. How the hell are we going to deal with an entire horde without Colt? Luke and Armin briefly glanced at one another. They almost seemed worried as they did so, as if an uncomfortable thought had just crossed both of their minds simultaneously. We do have somebody stronger than Colt on our side, probably even stronger than Visser. A secret weapon, if you will. I squinted at him. So, why the hell wasn't he here?
Because he's frickin' insane,
Armin responded.
He ain't a secret weapon. He's a last resort.
I'll call Valerie, Luke said, standing up. Have her wrangle him into New York.
Yeah, you do that,
Armin said, before looking over at me.
Brace yourself. Once we get to New York, it's gonna be a shit show.
When I was still in middle school, my math teacher once told me that I'd end up in the sewers if I kept phoning it in during class. I guess he was right. It was around 5 a.m. when we landed in Staten Island. The flight over was pretty quiet, with both Luke and Armin holding expressions that I knew all too well. It was the expression that one might make when they weren't quite sure what was going to happen next. "This is as much as I can help you," the pilot said, as he tried to hide the weary expression on his face. We nodded at him as he prepared to take off. He didn't seem enthusiastic about sticking around to see what would happen next, and I couldn't blame him for that. Losing a friend and Colt couldn't have felt too good either. We only had to wait about 10 minutes to be picked up. 4 vehicles, all different makes and models, pulled up, with a taller blonde woman coming out of the lead car. Her face seemed to be frozen in a perpetual grimace as she walked up to Luke.
"What the hell have you done?"
she said through gritted teeth, looking just about ready to break Luke's other arm on the spot.
"I thought you knew how to follow simple instructions."
"Yeah?" Luke responded, holding a similar expression to hers. "And I thought you knew how to recruit people. Your guy Visser was a damn mole, Valerie."
"What the hell are you talking about? Are you sure?"
"The sumbitch turned on us and then started filming the attack. He also killed Colt. So yeah, I'm pretty damn sure." Valerie's expression suddenly changed as she muttered something under her breath. And then she looked over at me.
"He's the new guy, right?"
I nodded in response.
"And Colt's the only one on our side dead?"
"Yeah," Luke responded.
"Good. I guess we broke even then. Time to go to Manhattan."
She turned, heading back towards the vehicle. I looked over at Luke, who just smirked. Wouldn't get on her bad side. We drove from Staten Island deep into Manhattan, before finally arriving at an unassuming-looking Chinese restaurant. "Let me guess," I said as we pulled up. "Another secret CIA base?" "Don't sound so surprised," Luke said as he hopped out. At that point, I suppose nothing should have surprised me at all. We passed through the main dining area before descending into the basement to find about 30 armed soldiers getting geared up. "Is this everybody?" Luke asked.
"Just about. Except for Gustafsson. He's in the freezer. I had a hell of a time getting him over here."
"Gustafsson? Is that the secret weapon you guys were talking about?"
"Last resort. And yeah."
Marcus Gustafsson. He was a 6'7" Swedish-American SOG agent who opted to join the fight against Kane. As with everybody else, he was also given a dose of the serum, but his body's response to it was a bit different from everybody else's. His strength and speed were elevated to ludicrous levels, far surpassing even Colt's. And couple that with his massive frame, and he was essentially a human wrecking ball. Those boosts came with a drawback, though. In exchange for his physical prowess, his mind degenerated into something comparable to a primal beast. If anybody were to stand in front of him, they were getting bulldozed, regardless of who they were. There was only one feasible way to control him, and that was by putting him into freezing temperatures. And when that happened, he was capable of retaining some degree of his old self, some degree of sanity.
"If we take him out, we'll only have about 30 minutes until he loses control again,"
Valerie continued to explain.
"And that means we'll have to work quick."
"Shouldn't be a problem. We only have to cover the entirety of Lower Manhattan's sewer system."
"Just get it done. You know how important this is. And don't fuck it up."
Luke rolled his eyes. "You don't need to tell me that, all right? Focus on yourself." She shot him a glare before walking away. "Jesus," Luke muttered, shaking his head before turning to me. "But she's right. This is important. It's also very dangerous. You've survived so far, but I couldn't really tell you what's about to happen next. If you want to back out right now, then that's fine. Your choice. With all that said, are you still coming with us? I already knew that the question was nothing more than a polite gesture. I could tell that I really didn't have an option at all. I was already in pretty deep, after all. And if the world really was at stake here, then they needed all the help they could get. I nodded and shook his hand. In some strange way, it felt like my fate had been sealed from the start regardless. We were headed into the sewers. We split up into 10 groups in order to cover more ground. I was with Luke and Armin, of course. The plan was simple in theory. We just had to locate where the robot aliens were being kept and eliminate them all. If we ran into Kane himself, then we needed to radio Valerie, lure him towards a rendezvous point, and shoot him with our last bullet. From there, we'd have to neutralize the remaining bolts and organize a scrub of any trace of their existence. And if things became a little too overwhelming, we'd have to resort to unleashing Marcus. I didn't say it'd be easy, just straightforward. I could think of about 100 different ways this could go south pretty quick. Nevertheless, this really was our only shot. As hard as I tried to mentally prepare myself for our descent into the murky tunnels, I still couldn't stop myself from gagging as we waded through the calf-deep river of who knows what. Luke and Armin weren't even trying to suppress their amusement at my discomfort. Is this funny? Does it smell good to you guys or something? We've been through a lot worse. This ain't really much in comparison. You want to hear some stories to pass the time while we search? Luke asked. I didn't take him up on the offer. I had to focus on not throwing up instead. After about 15 minutes of walking, we came across one of the creatures, which caused me to flinch as the light attached to my rifle illuminated it. Thankfully, it was dead. It also seemed to be different from the ones we'd encountered in Russia, more gruesome in appearance. It was about twice the size, so big that it nearly blocked the entire tunnel. It was also covered in what appeared to be boils, large, pulsing spheres that were fighting for space across its torso. Luke walked forward cautiously before quickly turning away, his hand clamped over his nose. Jesus, it smells like death, he muttered. Armin grabbed a knife off of his belt and stepped forward. What are you doing? I asked him. I just want to know what we're dealing with here. He chucked the blade at one of those boils, causing it to burst open. I couldn't stop myself from puking a little bit in my mouth after seeing what came out of it. These things began crawling out. There had to be dozens of them, all about the size of a large rat. They looked like spiders at first, but as they crawled closer to me, it became evident that they were just smaller versions of the creature. It looked like something straight out of hell itself. Oh, screw me. Weren't these things supposed to be robots? He looked around before stomping on one of the creatures and completely pulverizing it. I don't see any wires here. I looked back at the creature, watching as the boil started to bulge and thrash, as if the monstrosities within were getting ready to hatch at any moment. Biotechnology. Real taboo subject. It makes sense, though. Why build robots from scratch when you could just breed the organic matter and modify them at maturation? He seemed to know quite a bit about the topic. But still, I suppose this complicates things. Since the creature was blocking most of the tunnel, and we didn't want to risk accidentally popping another one out, we took a different route in order to keep searching. As noon began closing in, we still hadn't managed to find anything else of note. I could tell that Luke and Armin were getting worried, although they were doing a good job of hiding it. My mind began drifting and conjuring up images of these creatures running amok in Manhattan. How would people react? How the hell would the world respond? My thoughts suddenly halted when I started feeling something below me. It was rumbling, coming from beneath our feet. It didn't take a genius to realize what this meant. The creatures weren't being held in the sewer tunnels. They were being held underneath of them, and it seemed as if they were already on the move. We were 10 minutes away from noon, so we didn't exactly have the time to process an extensive plan. We simply had to act. Armin pulled out something that looked like a large block of C4 before planting it in the water. He detonated it, causing the water to flow into the hole that had been created. I could see another tunnel beneath as the rumbling continued to increase in intensity. Armin tossed a flashbang and we hopped down. There were no soldiers waiting for us, but what we found there was startling regardless. It wasn't just another sewer tunnel. It was a hallway, one that looked like it could have been plucked out of any office building. We were all in disbelief as we walked forward, staring at the inexplicable sight around us. We began hearing footsteps coming from the corridor behind us only moments later. It was no mystery what the source was, and we'd made a hell of a lot of noise coming down. I raised my rifle just as a group of soldiers turned the corner. I opened fire, but none of them even flinched in response. Of course, they were all on the serum. I glanced down at my watch, 5 minutes before noon, and from the sound of it, an entire army of robots were marching beneath us. "Let's go!" Armin yelled. I turned around, watching as him and Luke began running. We scrambled through corridor after corridor, trying feverishly to find another way down while evading the soldiers simultaneously. The pressure started mounting as they began converging on us at seemingly every corner. As hard as we looked, there didn't seem to be anywhere for us to go. Not that we had much time to begin with. We soon found ourselves in the middle of an intersecting corridor and being boxed in by soldiers in every direction. They weren't shooting at us or even running. Instead, they approached us calmly, almost as if they were robots themselves. I suppose they didn't need to rush. We were completely trapped.
"Ah, screw it,"
I heard Armin say. I looked over at him, watching as he pulled out another block of C4. "What the hell are you doing?" Luke asked.
"If it worked once, it'll work again. Brace yourselves."
He planted the explosive right beneath our feet and detonated it. I could feel a surging pain overwhelming my entire lower body as the floor broke beneath us, causing us to fall deeper into the strange underground complex. I'm not sure how far we fell. It had to be at least a few dozen feet, possibly a lot more. My head continued to ring as I tried to regain my bearings, looking around to see that we'd fallen into some sort of lab. And the more I looked, the more bizarre things became. The place was massive, almost too big for me to comprehend how it could have even been built. There were rows upon rows of glass chambers, filled with all matters of grotesque creatures. I looked over at Luke, who also seemed completely dumbstruck by the sight. Armin was fidgeting with the radio, likely trying to call Valerie.
"I can't reach you. I guess these things don't work this far below ground."
"Of course they don't. We gotta find a way out of here." Armin shook his head.
"Nah, we have to finish the mission. We need to find and kill Kane."
"What are you talking about? The invasion's already started," Luke responded, clearly floored at the thought of it.
"Does that change anything? We still got a job to do."
"Come on, man. Let's find a way out of here. Then we can regroup with the rest and come up with a better plan. There's nothing we can do here." Armin seemed to hesitate for a moment, his expression showing signs of apprehension. But in the end, Luke's words wouldn't deter him. He ran off by himself before either of us could say anything else. "Ah, hell," Luke muttered as he grabbed my arm. "Let's go." "Aren't we gonna go after him?" "Do we have time? The guy's made up his mind and we have our own asses to save." As wrong as it felt leaving him behind like that, I decided to follow Luke. I suppose he was right. This mission was over. Still, The chances of us making it back to the surface didn't seem so high. Also, what would be waiting for us once we got up there? Noon had already come and passed. I could only imagine the chaos that was already transpiring. As we ran through the seemingly endless lab, I could hear footsteps chasing us once again. We finally reached what seemed to be the end, only to be met with another adjacent corridor. This one lined with rows of metal doors and panels of glass in between. I glanced into a few of them as we ran, seeing people in heavy medical gear wielding massive tools, staining the walls with blood of unknown specimens. This whole operation clearly went deeper than Luke or I, or anybody on the outside could have imagined. We ended up running into another group of soldiers, who were storming right towards us from the other end. This time, there was no way of evading them. We were stuck in the middle of the corridor, with nowhere else to run and no more C4 left to detonate. Even if there was another level below us, I doubted that I wanted to see what was there. We just had to face them head on. I ran forward in an attempt to force myself through, but was immediately pushed back, the impact leaving me gasping for air. As I scrambled on the ground, I could feel an immense pressure wrapping around my neck, almost as if I was being strangled by a python. I didn't stay conscious for much longer after that. When I finally came to, I found myself sitting on the floor, my arms and legs bound by some kind of metal restraint. I tried struggling, but they wouldn't budge. I looked around, seeing just about everybody else in there with me. Luke, Armin, Valerie, and a larger, extremely beat-up man who I could only assume was Marcus. Even our last resort had been captured. We never really stood a chance, did we? I made eye contact with Luke, and then Armin. I knew that we were all thinking the same thing. This was nothing short of a complete and utter disaster. The rest of the room was pretty much empty, which was strange, since it was apparently large enough to hold upwards of 50 people. I had to wonder how much time and effort went into building a place like this. I could see a few soldiers guarding the exits, but no security beyond that. I couldn't understand why they hadn't just killed us. We must have just sat there in silence for about 15 minutes before somebody else finally walked in. It was a man of average height and extremely muscular build. Everybody else seemed to recognize him, as they stared with wide eyes and flared nostrils. As I would soon come to find out, this was Kane, the man behind all of the madness. He gave off a bizarre energy as he walked towards us, with his carefree movements and impossible-to-read expression. I wasn't sure if I was just going crazy, but I knew that I recognized him somehow. But I couldn't quite place where those memories may have stemmed from.
"Why don't you just kill us, Kane?"
Valerie said.
"There's no chance in hell we're joining you."
"Because that wouldn't help anybody," he said, stopping a few feet away from us. "You never gave me a chance to explain my intentions."
"That's something you have to earn,"
Armin said.
"And you lost that when you started murdering people."
Kane glanced over at him before shaking his head. "They wouldn't listen. I tried reaching out to them and they refused to hear me out. But I'm a patient man. I'm willing to give everybody here another chance. I'll explain why all of this is necessary." He paused for a moment, clearing his throat. "The first thing you need to know is, I'm not from this time. I'm not from a time where everything was all right, where anything made any sense. I come from a time of strife, from a place of absolute horror. I'm from the future."
"Oh, come on,"
somebody shouted.
"Screw off. You expect us to believe something like that?"
Kane didn't flinch at the outburst. He just continued speaking. "It's a substantial assertion, I understand that. One that requires proof behind it." He reached into his pocket and taking out a small, rectangular device that almost looked like a pistol magazine. He pointed the device at the ground, before firing off some sort of projectile. It looked like a metal circle, and quickly expanding upwards and forming what almost looked like a large oval-shaped mirror. But I have proof with me. I'll show you the future. The glassy substance within the mirror began morphing before we all found ourselves looking at an unfathomable scene. At that point, I had to wonder if I'd been hallucinating the whole thing. Perhaps this was one long, visceral fever dream, from CIA conspiracies to alien robots to some alleged time traveler that I vaguely recognized. None of it could possibly be real. But if that was the case, then why wasn't I waking up? I continued staring at whatever was unfolding in front of me, what was supposedly our future. It looked like Earth, but just barely. It wasn't even apocalyptic in the traditional sense. It almost looked like another world entirely. There was a forest, but the trees seemed to be much larger than they should have been. As I looked closer, I realized that the wood was covered in veins, and that the leaves had teeth, biting at these bird-like creatures that flew a bit too close. The mountains in the back had thick black smoke billowing out from the peaks, while the gargantuan entity lurked behind them, its colossal tendrils wrapped around the base. Grotesque creatures larger than airplanes populated the neon sky, while the lake below seemed to bubble with the activity of obscured monstrosities. It may be odd to accept, but it's the truth. This is a recording of the future. I was sent back with one purpose and one purpose only: to prevent this at any cost. We need a united population. The way the world is right now, with its superpowers at odds and countries locked in perpetual conflict, won't cut it. And it's only going to get worse from here. We won't be ready for the real invasion. We need a unifying event to save us. You can hate what I've done. It's justified. I understand. But just know that all of my efforts have been for the greater good. I wasn't quite sure what to think. Kane spoke with an air of confidence that couldn't have been denied. His words had conviction behind them, his tone unfaltering the entire way through. The evidence he was presenting was also undeniably significant. Was he right? Were we on track for a future as horrific as the one he was showing us? And could it be helped if we joined him? As convincing as it all seemed to be, there was one thing that I couldn't shake. A feeling deep within my psyche that told me that all of this was wrong. That the man standing in front of us was absolutely not to be trusted. Where had I recognized him from? On top of everything else, this was starting to drive me crazy. Kane began walking around, intently scanning our group, looking for a shift in attitude. I know it feels like I betrayed you all, and I'm sorry for it. But there are some things that simply need to be done. Soon enough, he made his way over to me and stopped. Had he recognized me first? A new recruit, he said, looking down at me. I suppose I don't have the same kind of history with you. I'm sure everything your comrades have told you about me came from a noble place. But I'm just trying to save life as we know it for the future generations. What do you think? Are you with me? I looked up at him, staring into his eyes directly for the first time. And that's when I figured it out. I realized where I'd recognized him from. It was unmistakable. One of his eyes had likely been injured in the past, leaving nothing but a milky white behind. The sight of it had triggered a memory so repressed in the back of my mind that I hadn't thought about it in years. I nodded my head. Yeah, I'll join you. Kane got down on a knee, getting eye level with me. You're sure? He asked. This is important. I want to fight for the future. He smiled. I could tell that he hadn't recognized me at all. Thank you, my friend. Soon enough, you'll know that your decision was the right one. What the hell are you doing? This is a trap.
He's not telling you the truth?
Armin shouted. I ignored him, continuing to look forward instead. Kane went ahead and loosened my restraints before holding his hand out to me. I accepted, and he pulled me up to my feet, patting me on the back. "Your descendants will thank you," he said. I stepped past him, walking towards the strange mirror world. "Can I ask you a question?" "Of course," Kane replied, walking over to me. "Why can't you remember me?" Before his expression could even register the confusion, I grabbed him by the neck and sent us both crashing into the mirror. We fell through, hitting dirt as we did so. As I'd expected, he wasn't showing us a recording of the future at all. This was something else entirely. As we scrambled on the ground, I saw the device fly out from his pocket, landing on the ground a few feet away. This also ended up closing the portal entirely. "Oh!" Kane screamed. "What the hell have you done?" I leapt up and tried grabbing the device but was pulled back down and slammed by Kane. He really was strong, but I couldn't let him win. We continued to fight, although it gradually devolved into a one-sided beatdown. I may have bitten off more than I was able to chew with this guy. He ended up cracking me across the jaw with a vicious elbow, which caused me to black out for just a moment. I fell to the ground, stars now littering my vision. Kane stood over me, his face twisted into a spiteful grimace. "Who the hell are you?" he asked. I really couldn't believe that he didn't remember. What was one of the most disturbing moments in my entire life must have been par for the course for him. My encounter with Kane happened early in my career, back when I was a little more optimistic about my future. I was in France, where I'd just been paid for a contract and was riding high on my emotions. I just needed a few more paydays and I'd be good. Then I could move on to bigger and better things. I was walking through Paris at night, enjoying the crisp breeze and a nice expensive cigar. At one point, I turned into a completely empty street, which is where I saw her. It was a young girl, maybe in her early 20s, walking by herself. Something that wouldn't have been a cause for concern on its own, but the details made it quite alarming. She seemed to be wearing nothing but a torn hospital gown, and her movements were frenetic, almost as if she wasn't quite sure where she was going. She soon spotted me and began running over. I backed up just a bit, unsure of what to expect from something like this. Perhaps she posed no physical threat to me, but any and all risk was better off avoided. In any case, I eased up as she got closer. She looked to be in extreme distress. She began speaking to me, her words coming out in a rapid and jumbled mess. My French wasn't great to begin with, so trying to decipher what she was saying proved to be quite the task. However, I could make out a few key phrases. "Help me, please," and "Save my brother." She grabbed my arm and began pulling me, trying to get me to follow her. I was hesitant at first, but ultimately relented. I knew that this could end horribly for me, but the idea of being the hero gave me hope for some kind of catharsis. Maybe I could wash away all of the morally ambiguous things I've done with one act of altruism. I really did think that was how the world worked back then. Eventually, she led me to what must have been the most decrepit building in the darkest corner of Paris, a place that looked so uninviting, even the most daring of ghost hunters would have avoided it. "The basement," she said, looking up at me with teary eyes and a petrified expression. She really must have experienced something horrifying in there. "He's in the basement, please hurry," she said in French. Against my better judgment, I went in. The place looked like it must have been a store at one point, but I couldn't have been too sure. The smell of mold lingered in the dusty air as I walked, hand gripping my pistol as I searched for a door leading down. It didn't take me long to find it, and I began traversing down the rickety wooden steps, trying to make sure that I wouldn't get clocked in the back of the head with an axe once I got down. I ended up in a hallway, which felt strange, since it didn't line up with the rest of the building's aesthetics. This place looked newer and relatively well-maintained, as if it were actually still being used for something. I got to the end of the passage, where a locked door was waiting for me. I went ahead and kicked it down, revealing an even stranger sight beyond. Another hallway, this time with metal doors and windows on either side. At this point, I began tensing up. It felt as if I was seeing something that I really wasn't supposed to be. Most of the rooms were empty, evident from the fact that their lights were off and I couldn't see anything inside. There was only one that wasn't. Light poured into the hallway from one window near the end. I remember my arms shaking as I got within a few steps, feeling the pressure in the air getting heavier every time I inched forward. And then I looked inside. Through the window, I could see a bloody operating table with a boy strapped to it. His stomach was opened, and it looked like a few of his organs had been removed and replaced with some mechanical counterpart. And then, the man who was operating on him came into view. His face had been blurred out of my memory for so long, but I was seeing him clearly now. He was standing in front of me, both in my mind and in real life. He saw me looking at him and gave me a sinister grin, one that was equal parts smug and sadistic. It was as if me stumbling upon his operation wouldn't be a problem for him in the slightest. I could feel my arms raising instinctively, my mind screaming at me to shoot and kill him. I could tell that I was looking at an extremely dangerous individual. I fired off 3 or 4 bullets through the glass, all of them hitting the man square in the forehead. But instead of dropping to the ground, his grin just grew wider. It almost looked inhuman, as if there wasn't actually a man there at all, just a primal force of destruction. I remember backing up slowly, my limbs completely stiff from the shock. The man opened the door and stepped out, approaching me in a way that was disturbingly nonchalant. I tried getting up and running, but I didn't make it too far. I blacked out after only a few steps and woke up some indeterminable amount of time later, face first in the grass and dirt. My head was pounding as I got up, finding myself standing in a park near the hotel I was staying at. My phone and wallet were still in my pocket, so I checked the time to see that it was 9 a.m. the next day. For the longest time, I couldn't tell if what I'd experienced was real or not. Eventually, I settled on the latter. I thought it was better to just delude myself than consider the alternative. But I remembered one thing very clearly from that night. I knew where the building was, the one that the girl had led me to. I almost didn't want to do it, but I knew that I had to. I needed to go back into that building and see what was really there. So that's what I did. I ventured all the way back down those streets, feeling my unease mounting every time I got closer. I could almost see that girl running in front of me again. If all of this was real, then where was she now? Eventually, I made it back to the spot where the building was, half expecting it not to be there at all. But that wasn't the case. It was still there, now sealed off by police tape. The cops who were guarding the place eyed me curiously as I walked past. I almost considered asking them what had happened in there, but decided it was best not to. Over the years, I gradually managed to purge that memory from my system. I convinced myself that there was absolutely no chance something like that had actually happened, and that it was all better off forgotten. It looks like I've been wrong the entire time, but it's also how I knew that Kane wasn't telling the truth. I'll ask again. Who the hell are you? He spat at me. As Kane continued approaching me, I was at a loss for what to do. The device was still on the ground behind him, but getting it was a secondary concern. I needed to prevent him from snapping my neck first. Fighting him directly was obviously out of the question, so I needed a more creative approach. But what was I supposed to do here? As I tried backing up away from him, I felt a sharp pain in one of my arms. I looked down, seeing that some kind of insect had burrowed its way up from the dirt and was now gnawing away at my skin. Not long after, I began feeling something shifting below me. The insect that had bit me, a worm-like creature, began growing longer and longer as it rose up from beneath. After only a few seconds, it had become taller than an adult male, showing no signs of slowing down either. And then, the ground itself began rising up. That wasn't just some insect. It was attached to something much larger, and we were right on its back. Dozens of worm-like appendages began shooting up out of the ground as the creature decided to stand up, understandably pissed off at our presence. It started moving, causing both Kane and I to stumble as it did so. On top of that, the creature's appendages began lunging at us, gradually chipping away bits of our flesh. I stood up and took my knife out and tried to intercept some of them with my blade before they could bite me further, which proved to be a task more difficult than I could manage. I could hear a deep growling from below, feeling the vibrations at my feet simultaneously. This thing must have been bigger than the White House. There was enough room on its back to play a few rounds of golf. I looked over at Kane, who seemed to be handling the appendages easier than I was. I shouldn't have been surprised. He was probably familiar with the creatures here. One of them wrapped around my ankle before nearly dragging me off of its back entirely. I managed to cut it off just before that could happen. I looked down at what was beneath, seeing much larger appendages lurking below, their mouths wide open and lined with knife-like teeth, presumably waiting to snatch us up as we fell. I scrambled away, a shiver overwhelming my body at the thought of it happening. But I also realized something in that moment. In order to beat Kane, I just needed to use my surroundings. Easier said than done, but that was my only chance. I got back up, looked him dead in the eyes, and ran right towards him, ignoring the pain from the relentless bites in the process. He saw me coming and threw me to the side, and pushing me closer to the edge of his back as he did so. But that's exactly what I'd expected him to do. Kane was already preparing to charge back at me. I stood, as if I were getting ready to meet his charge with a rush of my own. He moved first, as I waited for a few seconds before moving myself. I could see the rage in his eyes as he got closer to me. He wasn't thinking rationally anymore. Otherwise, he likely wouldn't have fallen into the trap that I'd set for him. If we collided head-on, then there was no doubt that I'd be the one who'd get bodied off, so I wasn't going to do that. Before we could make contact, I quickly moved to the side, putting my foot out just far enough to trip him over it. He was moving so fast that he could hardly react in time. I watched as his body flew forward, stumbling downwards and out of view. I didn't let myself breathe until I heard him scream. It must have been the deepest breath that I had taken in years. But I wasn't done yet. I began looking around me, searching for his portal device. I knew that I wasn't getting out of here without it. I spotted it at the other end of the creature's back, getting dangerously closer to falling off with each step that I took. I ran over to it, managing to grab it just before that could happen. I looked over the device and saw an array of buttons and switches, none of which I could possibly comprehend the function of. There was one button at the center that was clearly larger and more distinguished from the rest. Before I pressed it, my mind began running down the list of things that might happen. There was no guarantee that this would take me back, that this would even take me anywhere better. I looked up, taking in the apocalyptic hellscape around me. In some ways, it was quite beautiful. I'd never seen a sky with that kind of color before. It was almost mesmerizing. Nevertheless, I sure as hell knew that I couldn't stay. I pointed the device down before pressing the button, and to my relief, another mirror-like portal began materializing. As I prepared to move through it, the creature suddenly stopped moving. It fell to the ground with a large thud, causing me to land on my ass. All of the appendages stopped bothering me as well. Was it dead? I thought to myself. I could hear something coming from behind me, something that sounded like labored breathing. I turned around, and coming face to face with one of the most horrific sights I could have seen at that moment. It was Kane, covered in bloody bite marks. There had been a huge chunk taken out of one of his arms, while a portion of his skull had been exposed at the top. He began limping towards me, his expression so demented that I couldn't even meet his own eyes with mine without feeling complete despair. "You thought that would be the end of me," he said in a raspy growl. "I won't stop. I'll never stop." I stopped thinking about what might be on the other side, and turning my back on him and jumping through the portal. I could feel cold wind biting at my battered skin as I did so. I found myself standing in freezing drizzle along a rocky beach shore. I quickly pressed the button again, closing the portal behind me, just as Kane was getting ready to make it through as well. It was finally over. Despite the excruciating pain that I was in, my lips curled into a grin, and I began screaming into the wind. This was my moment of catharsis. I looked at my surroundings, seeing no signs of any creatures around. It did seem like I was on Earth again. I began walking, trying to find my way back to some sort of civilization, but my body had pretty much reached its limits. I passed out before I could make it anywhere. Thankfully, somebody found me before I could freeze to death. I woke up in a small wooden cabin, basking in the warmth of a space heater placed right next to my bed. My wounds had all been bandaged up, and there was a nice, savory scent lingering in the air, which caused my mouth to water incessantly. I wasn't quite sure how long it had been since my last meal. I sat up and looked around, spotting a woman, probably in her early 30s, cooking over a stove just a few feet away from me. She saw me looking over and smiled. "Oh, good. You're awake. Are you hungry?" She sounded Icelandic. I guess that's where I ended up. Even though I'd tried controlling myself, my manners were pretty much non-existent at that point. I slurped up 5 bowls of that stew without a care in the world. The woman didn't seem to mind, though. She didn't ask that many questions either, and I appreciated that. "Oh," she said as I put the last bowl up to my mouth and ate the last pieces of fish. "This is yours, isn't it? I found it lying a few feet away from you." She was holding the portal device. I'd nearly forgotten about it. I thanked her and put it into the drawer beside the bed. It's been a few days since she found me. Even though she said that I could stay here for as long as I'd like, I don't plan on bothering her like that. Using her laptop, I've done some research, and I've concluded that this is not the same Earth that I left behind. It's similar, but not identical. A few key details have all but confirmed that. Back in my world, Kane has already started the invasion, and even though he's dead, I'm pretty sure he wasn't running that whole operation alone. Hell, I can't even be sure that he is dead. I'm not going to take the easy way out and stay here for the rest of my life. After all, I still have a mission to accomplish. That might take some time, though. Hey everybody, Nightmares Nightly here. If you made it this far, thanks so much for listening to the video. And I'd like to give a huge thank you to Mr. Outlaw for allowing his story to be narrated. He has a playlist on the channel of more of his stories if you'd like to hear more. He's written some of the greatest creepypastas around, all the way from My Friend Has Been Living in an Alternate Reality to I'm a guard stationed at a secret government facility. Check out his Reddit page if you'd like to see more. And if you noticed, this story was 2 hours and all done in one upload. If you prefer getting the story in one shot instead of in multiple parts, leave a comment down below, or let me know if you prefer the story broken into segments. And, as always, thanks for listening, everybody.